Again, welcome to the August meeting. I'll just give the apologies from Professor Marie Gleeson, Professor Joe May, David Cameron, and as I mentioned, Gioni is an apology as well. So just acknowledgement to country. I'd like to acknowledge the Awabakal lands that we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. We're on a Awabakal land here at Callaghan campus, but we have people joining us from various other countries, including Darkinjung, Biripi, Warramai, Wonnarua and Aurora Nation, sorry. So look, if there's any other countries that you're zooming in from today, other than these, yep, just share in the chat so we know where you're coming from. And I'll also just remind people to put themselves on mute during the meeting and particularly the presentation. Sometimes we get a little bit of audio interference, and encourage you to use the chat if you have any questions to ask our speakers. If you've got any updates, just pop anything in the chat or put your hand up if you would like to ask a question. So we'll move on to our first speaker. I'll introduce you to Dr. Paula Jane Byrne. So Paula's going to speak to us today about the Rusden family and things. The project's concerned with women and intellectual life in New South Wales from 1830 to 1880, and part of a broader concern with cultures of colonisation. So she's going to speak to us about Anne Rusden of Maitland, who wrote on theology, science and politics, and her letters to her daughter, Savannah Scott. The paper examines some of her ideas through a discussion of things the family owned. And at the moment, Paula is a visiting scholar down at the State Library of New South Wales, so that's where she's zooming in from today. But she has been the author of several books, Criminal Law and Colonial Subject, and also editor of Diaries and Letters of Ellis Bent. So, Paula, welcome to the Hunter Living Histories meeting.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's good. I'm glad you could join us. And I'll just share your presentation. It is, and I'll just get it here. It was here. Let me just see. Oh, you can't see that, can you? No.
No.
I'm just going to
I might start talking and then you can have a look.
You start talking and I'll find it and present.
Because I really don't need it to slide.
Okay, sure.
To just, and that's just the major picture that everyone's been looking at for the advertisement anyway. So yeah, even if past that, you're okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal land, and I acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm most grateful for the opportunity to speak in this series. I have a connection with the Hunter. My great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, Margaret Doyle, was convict laundress on the Bingle estate, PNBN, in the 1830s. My family moved to Murrurundi, then the Clarence, then the Tweed River, under the Queensland border, and I've written extensively about the colonising culture of the Tweed and the Clarence. This paper is going to move through a number of stages in discussing things belonging to the Rusden family of Rathluba and later Holmwood and Maitland in the years from 1836 to 1860. The beginning concerns things that are plain in meaning for the historian. They can be read clearly and without difficulty. The first, which is slide 2, is a sampler made in 1797 by the Reverend George Keylock Rusden's sister, Anne. The sampler's subject is education, and if we look closely, If we look closely at it, we know that it refers to the education of children, both boys and girls. The sampler is not unusual in its sentiments. As we know from the work of Ruth Symes, girls' education was a high priority of the late 18th century in England, and girls were educated to the standard of boys and in the same subjects, classics, languages, and the natural sciences. Girls' education was not cursory or minimal, as had been thought before Ruth Symes' work. I want you to see netted across the Hunter Valley with its runs and settlements, these educated women and girls, deriving from this English concern with education. The project examines the thought of these colonising people and how they saw themselves. The next thing the historian can plainly see are books. Anne Rusden was the wife of the Reverend George Keylock Rusden. The family arrived on the Hunter in 1834. Sarana married Helena Scott of Glendon, and Jude Conway has already written of Anne's daughter Rose Selwyn and her granddaughter Rose Scott, two major personages in Australian feminist history. There are over 1,000 letters surviving between Anne and her daughters, and from these letters I've been able to list where the books were obtained. Books were posted from England. They were ordered from English booksellers. They were also obtained at Sydney at the Religious Tract Society in King Street. I want you to go to slide 4, I think it is, which is that one. This is King Street in 1846. And we're looking down from George Street up to the hill. And so there was a shop, a bookshop there. Lipscomb's shop in Maitland in 1846 is the next one next slide. Thank you. I'll leave that on for a bit. Lipscomb's shop in Maitland in 1846, Dykeman's store in Maitland in 1846, and the Maitland Book Depository in 1853. Also, Whittaker's Inn was where auctions of books were held, usually deriving from bankruptcy. Georgiana and Grace Rusden also obtains books from the Morpeth Book Depository for St. Peter's Church, a library which they ran. These books included poetry, Longfellow, Milton, Cowper. The library did not only consist of religious books. From descriptions of buying books or giving books, we find that books were readily available in Maitland from the 1830s, and that books appeared in the colony quite soon after publication. What becomes more difficult for the historian is what reads these books. We now see letter writing as part of the production of self in the 19th century. The historian can sometimes see a self that the letter writer did not see, and such an approach to writing history is as old as Namia. Anne Rusden in her letters represents women in a specific relationship to God. Women and God are involved with light and brightness, and women and God can both pour out blessings and sorrows. Men are not related to this imagery in Anne's letters. Light derives from Genesis, and pouring derives from the temple of Artemis in Greece and was incorporated into early Christianity. This is what women are to Anne. To be this close to God is a secure position. It's also a powerful position, but is one I'm not sure if Anne is entirely aware of. While the imagery was in common use by Anglican women, it is not used in the same manner as Anne. It would be wrong to identify Anne as Tractarian or High Church Anglican because she shows such mysticism. Tractarianism wanted to return to the rituals of the ancient Christian church led by bishops. All of the religious books Anne refers to are evangelical, and it is these that she discusses with her daughters, though one would never describe her as an evangelical Anglican. No missionaries were ever mentioned by her, and she did not think that entertainment should be circumscribed. Discussion about religious matters, about all matters, is solely among women in Anne's letters. On the Hunter River, books and tracts were lent and discussed by women among themselves without any reference to men, even religious men. From Anne's letters, we can also tell how books were read. And for the historian, it means reading these texts. The texts that she mentions refer to and looking to see how Anne actually read them herself. The evangelical beliefs that Anne read related to God's reasoning being impossible for humans to comprehend. Thus, Helena Scott's bankruptcy was sent by God as a trial for Serena Scott, Anne's daughter, for reasons that could not be fathomed. For Christians, it was better to repose willingly and peacefully in this ignorance of God's motivations. And this had to be frankly acknowledged and fully realized. Such a positioning of God created safety in an uncertain world. What this view of God also did was to open up the world to science and human investigation. The safe ignorance one retreated to allowed for secular engagement and scientific investigation. Nature's mechanisms provided proof of God, and the more nature including human nature, was investigated, the more God's kindness and love would be demonstrated. The Rusden women took an active interest in science. They're interested in phrenology, the reading of the shape of the head, and this science is the subject of a forthcoming book by Alexandra Rodzinski, one of the fellows here. They were interested in electromagnetism and what would later be called hypnosis. This also relates to the collecting and sharing of plants, and Grace Rusden, Anne's daughter, conducted experiments in science. Reading differing religious interpretations of scripture led to critiques of bishops who really were articles of consumption for the Rusden women. The women felt themselves quite equal intellectually to the bishops. From such a perspective, it was easy to move into discussion of the new democracy. Anne herself thought that the whole political system should be based on the litany. She was as bad as Macbeth, but he was coward and therefore, to my mind, more despicable. Shakespeare does well to portray her to the last, to show that with all her lofty daring, she becomes a very coward at heart. What is valued by Anne is boldness and lofty daring, and it was unfortunate this fell away in Lady Macbeth. There are frequent references in Anne's letters to strengthening girls' minds through education. The woman represented by Anne has strength of mind, humility, and in this way she maps a public woman for her daughters and granddaughters. You will note there's no blood discussed in terms of Lady Macbeth. This is another case where the letter writer tells us more than they perhaps intended. And there's a lot of humour around violence in Anne's letters that seems shocking. Mark Dunn has already told you that there's a great gap in the Scott family papers around the years of the Mile Creek Massacre in 1838 and the subsequent political controversies in which the Scott brothers played a major role. The making of this gap is interesting in itself. It may have happened before the papers were presented to the library, or it may have happened after. And I'm thinking of James Bonwick and his team of women transcribers carefully excising detail from the transcriptions of the 1819 Big Report to avoid naming convicts. We can't really know the emotions around the excisions in the Scott family papers. At what point did violence become something unedifying in creating the archive? This excision included Anne's letters. The historian cannot speculate on something that is not there. It loses the sense of the thing. However, Anne does provide us with one of the most aggressive statements of the period, where she argues that Aboriginal people should have been taught a sharp lesson on the English arrival in the colony, that they now knew too much about tactics to be properly defeated. In this letter from 1845, she's referring to an English military expedition, and she refers to herself and the military as we. So alongside all of her mystical relationship to God, this is this envisioning of the self as part of British military might. This is very different to where violence to Indigenous people appears for men in their letters and diaries of the period and later. In imagining Anne, one has to combine these strands of an unfathomable God. We don't know why things happen. And strong women with militarism. This is one of the major aims of the project, to see what colonized and to track a sensibility and try and see a mind. Along the way in this research, there are things I noticed, so that there's a few side papers. Sometimes these are given or appear before the major work, so to speak, but they have bearing. And they include fabric and dress, what constituted a marriage, the making of boys, and emotions around bankruptcy. Historians do this if left alone. They meander up pathways and stop a while. And I'm most grateful to the State Library of New South Wales in letting me be a visiting scholar in order to work creatively in contact with other scholars, really in a world where thinking and sticking to a hypothesis is valued as the model for scholarship. I have got a whole section on symbolism, but how much time do I have left?
Look, you probably got about another 5 minutes.
All right, I'll go. Okay. I think we'll just go to those slides. These slides of, I was going to talk about the first slide. I'll just talk about that and then I will go to those slides really briefly. The verse on the sampler, the first slide, comes from John Huddleston Wynne. His choice emblems, natural, historical, fabulous, moral and divine for the improvement and pastime of youth, was published in 1772. That's the one before that, I think. The one with the sampler, yeah, thank you. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the project, as it's possible to miss contemporary understandings of the import of symbols. The verse on the sampler, the first slide, reads, "See what evil plight yon vine appears, nor spreading leaves, nor purple clusters bears. But if around the elm her arms she throws, or by some friendly prop supported grows, soon shall the stem with foliage green, and clustered grapes beneath the leaves be seen." This was the frontispiece to his book, and while the educator in the attached drawing is a woman, and the educated are both female and male, one can't read this verse without being reminded of the sensibility of the 18th century. There is a lightness and passion in the poem, the arms of the vine thrown through space round the elm, and a contrasting, reassuring, friendly prop. It moves from death to life, as the vine symbolizes, associated with the god Dionysus and with Christ and the resurrection. The excerpt ends with a game, looking under, looking beneath, almost erotic. The verse gives the feel of the 18th century, and in my description so far, I have not noted Anne's lightness and humour, her spite and her playfulness in letters. And we'll just go to those last two slides, very last two. It's the book. Yeah, this book. This is a book by Rose, given to Rose Rusden by Arthur Selwyn in 1851. And I'm looking at the symbolism now. I just want to, it's sort of like a scrapbook or a commonplace book. And the next slide, I'll just show you what's in there. These are 3 ivy leaves. And this is made by Amelia Rusden for Rose and sent from England. And it was from a grave. I'm doing a lot of work on the imagery associated with creating that, because the 3 you see is the Trinity. And Rose had a great interest in Tractarianism. To those people, the Trinity was very important. So Rose did engage with Tractarian ideas. The next one, the next slide. Yes, you can see how carefully she sewed the ivy leaves onto the paper. So this is a major effort. And this person whose grave she visited is an extremely important person to her. That's the Reverend William Adams. I'll just finish now. This paper has considered the relationship between the Rusden family to 3 kinds of objects. The sampler with its message of pleasure and education, the evangelical books and where were they bought and how they were read, and a loose page of Rose Selwyn's scrapbook. They give us some insight into what exactly colonized the hunter. Thank you. That's all.
Paula, thank you so much for that presentation and sharing your research and knowledge of this important history. And apologies to that bit of interference with someone must have forgot to put themselves on mute. So yes, I couldn't sort of mute it quick enough. So apologies for that. Does anyone have any questions for Paula?
Yes, if I could just ask a couple of quick questions there. Paula, I'm in the throes of finishing a book on the chaplains, bishops and deans of Newcastle from 1821 to 2021. And of course, Rusden figures in that, George Keillock Rusden. And as you mentioned, their daughter Rose married the first dean of Christchurch Cathedral. I've also read Jude Conway's material as well, which is very, very good. I was wondering if I might be able to exchange a couple of emails with you about some more details on the Rusden family, and if you feel comfortable about that. I'm trying to make the material as comprehensive as I can, and so maybe if I send you some of the material I've written, you might make a comment on it if you're interested.
I'd love to. I'd love to. Yes, yes. You could get my email address from the Hunter Living History, I think, site. I think it may be on there, but if it's not, I'm sure that it can be found. Okay.
Yeah, one way or another, I'll get it through Anne or through HOH or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I understand Rose Solomon was a champion chess player too.
Yes, yeah, they played a lot of chess, and at the same time as when Arthur came, when he first came, he introduced a lot of games, and they had a lot of games because it was a long time before they married. He didn't have any money. Originally Arthur was going to be a squatter, and he didn't have enough money to do that, so he had to content himself with being a reverend, and but he. His uncle that was the Archbishop in New Zealand who came to visit as well. Yes, I remember that, him coming. So, yes, he had to content himself with being a reverend. I haven't read a great deal of Arthur's letters to other people. I have read some of George Keillock Rusden's. But yes, I'm looking forward to communicating with you.
That'd be great. We'll send you a bit of material on George Keillock and maybe on Arthur Selwyn as well. There's obvious crossover there with information. So that'd be great.
Yes.
That'd be really good.
Yes.
Thanks, I'll enjoy it. Thanks, Paula.
Okay.
So Paula, with your permission, we'll add your email to the Hunter Living Histories site, and that way people can contact you directly. Jude, did you have a question?
Hi, Paula. Thanks for that. It was great to know that there's all these letters. I mean, I was only researching in Newcastle, so I haven't accessed all those letters that you've accessed, and I look forward to seeing the outcome of what you write up on the letters between Anne Rusden and Serena Scott.
Thank you.
There's also a lovely comment from Emily, who's our Vera Deakin Regional History intern, said wonderful, insightful presentation. Thank you. So that's nice, Emily. Any other questions at all? Oh, Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Paula. It's so wonderful to see how the project's evolving after our many conversations in the library, and it's just magnificent. It's so interesting that these women are keeping up to date with the latest literature, and they're reading evangelical works, even though that's not necessarily where their faith lies. Can you frame, or can this be framed as a kind of experimentation? And do you get a strong sense of things that they're kind of really taking up from the readings and things that they're rejecting as well in this process of kind of keeping up to date with new scientific and theological knowledge.
Yes, that's an interesting idea, that it's like an experimentation with religion. At this time, though, the Anglican religion was a place of great, for the whole century really, great debate and argument. And so women joined in those arguments, in a sense. I particularly like their relationship to the bishops, where they treat them as articles of consumption, and they look at them and say, I don't like the way he presented it, and I don't like the ideas that he had, and I agree with the bishop, you know, that kind of thing. And though I thought of it first, you know, that sort of stuff. And I was particularly interested in that, and that ability to do that is an Anglican ability of the century, to be able to argue and debate, and so it's more into that it fits. So women in England, though, are writing quite a bit. At this time, there's a marvellous article by Marianne Ann Taylor, and it's a really wonderful article on Anglican women's publications during this period, and I just found it recently, so I'm really happy to have caught it. That they women were major publishers in the Anglican faith. Yeah.
Look, thanks again, Paul. If there's no other questions, we might sort of move on to some really brief updates. We've also got Jude Conway, who's going to present. Nisha, I've just been corresponding now with her on Teams, and yeah, she may be presenting as well. So again, Paula, thank you so much. You're welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting, or yeah, you can go back to research there at the library. But yeah, it's been great having you. So look, just our updates for the month. Like I said, Johnny has sent a few that he's pulled together and just sent me prior to this meeting. But before we go on to special collections, are there any updates? I know Kerry Shaw from local studies and the digital library, she sort of sent a link to an exhibition. Are you at this meeting, Kerry? Is there anything you wanted to update on that latest exhibition?
Yeah, I'm here. So we have an exhibition opening on Friday the 7th of August. And sorry, it's about wine and alcohol. I'm just looking up the proper title though. Publicans, brewers, winemakers and teetotalers is the exhibition, and it
I think I've got it here somewhere.
Yeah, I was going to pop the link in. So the launch night is on Friday the 7th. If you want to come to that, you'll need to book some tickets. And then the exhibition will run for a month or so. I'm not entirely sure of the close-off date. So the exhibition explores Newcastle's breweries and winemaking history, as well as iconic hotel buildings and the anti-alcohol temperance movement. So it includes parts of the archives of renowned hunter winemaker Maurice O'Shea from Mount Pleasant. So it's on at the Lovett Gallery, which is on the second floor of the Lehman Street Library.
No, thanks for that. Now, are there any updates from any of the other groups? Amanda, I know you're here from the Hunter National Trust branch, it's now called.
Yep. Hello. National Trust has always been quite busy. Just two brief ones I'll update on. The Newcastle School of Arts, we've had an involvement with. Their first DA we commented on. They've now lodged a revised DA, and that's gone through. They've reduced one floor off the building. So if anyone doesn't know, the Newcastle School of Arts is on the corner of Perkins, Hunter and King in town. So we're very happy about that because it sits above the heritage building, and it better reflects the adjacent buildings, which are one of them's listed. The other building, which I'll comment on, which I might have mentioned last time, it's in Maitland. Our remit goes quite wide. It's in 416 High Street. It's the old Bond warehouse store. there. That's currently up for exhibition, and we're pulling that together to comment. It's earmarked for full demolition and replacement. I think it's 4 to 5 story. It's a large apartment building that's being proposed there. So we're going to object and put quite a deep submission in on that one. And they're the main ones that have been worked on anyway.
Thanks, Amanda. Now, are there any other updates? I think there might actually be a bit of an overlap with possible updates that Johnny has provided. So, Don, did you?
Yes, thanks, Anne. The Dulwood Restoration Association at Dulwood House on Saturday, the 3rd of September, the 192nd anniversary of the planting of the first grapes in Australia's oldest vineyard. And it will be Descendants Day at Dulwood, the descendants of any of the Wyndhams, any of their convicts, any of the German vine dressers, any of the colonial-born or immigrant employees, right down from the 1824 when David Messier first acquired the property from its native owners, right down through the Wyndhams, the Penfolds, and the Wyndham estate. And if anybody is interested in coming along, we've got 3 speakers. Dr. Paul Keim, who's a descendant of one of the German vine dressers from Dulwood, will be talking about his ancestors there and the role of the German vine dressers in the Hunter Valley wine industry. Professor Howard Bridgman will be talking about George Wyndham's granddaughter, Marion Wyndham of Wollong, and her weather observations that he lightly touched on at our previous meeting here. And I'll be talking about the identification of the convicts who actually built Dulwood House. So I'll put my contact details if you want any details or an invitation. I'll put that on chat now.
That'd be good. Thank you, Don. Now, Ron, did you have an update from the Port Scratchley Society?
Yes, Anne. With cruise ships coming back, just to point out that there's a number of posts about the gun firings. The pattern is that the captain or the first officer of the ship comes up at 1 o'clock and fires the 6-inch gun, and then when the ship departs, there's a salute of 3 fired, and there's a range of dates, most of which relate to the Coral Princess, which is coming in several times or numerous times in the next for the rest of the year. And there are other ships as well. So they're as they occur, they're posted on our Facebook page. Thanks, Anne.
Yeah. Thank you, Ron. Does anyone else have any updates from their sort of group or projects they're working on? Well, I'll just just go through some of the updates from Joni, and then there might be people that are already involved in these as well. But he's wanted to highlight that the former, current producer of the Elvis Baz Luhrmann film that's just been released, a local person called Jamison Shaw. He went to Hunter School of Performing Arts, and he was producer, supervising music editor of the production, and had the great privilege of accessing the vault of over 800 Elvis recordings, which would have been a fantastic experience for anyone. So yeah, that's sort of a nice local connection and access to archives. The University of Newcastle's recently launched the new Reconciliation Action Plan, also called a RAP. So the university's embedding the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content and perspectives into all its courses and curriculum, and investigating dual names for its spaces and structures to increase patronage for of First Nations businesses as part of its reconciliation action plan. Now, I know Kua may have been joining us at the meeting after 1:30, but he might still be in the reading room. But if he does join us later, he might have further to say on that. There's also Victoria Theatre had some good news in that it had an announcement of some funding, $4 million to go towards helping with the upkeep of the state's oldest surviving theatre. So gentleman Matt Endicott, who's social planner and involved in that refurbishment, he's going to join us at a future meeting. He's reached out to us, and he's hoping to sort of address this group at the next meeting or the following one and talk further about that. Now, next Sunday or Saturday, the 8th of August, we've got a book launch, Roland Bannister. So those details I think I've sent out in the email. Roland, is there anything more you want to say about that? You're on mute.
I just want to get the date right. Sunday the 7th. Okay,
on here, Jamie's got the 8th, so I'll make sure that that's corrected.
Sunday morning at 10:30.
10:30. Okay, so yeah, I'll make sure that that is that information is all up to date.
Okay.
Thank you, Roland. And the other news that was in the media was relating to a story of a rare 19th century ship figurehead found at Taree. It was an article written by Mike Scanlon, and that, yeah, she was dressed in old-fashioned style, decaying from old age. Not unusual considering like a nameless object, but it's rare for 19th century ship figureheads. Might be about 150 years old, so this might be one that Peter Hoban's interested in. From the Maritime Centre, but it's donated early last month to the Mid-North Coast Maritime Museum at Port Macquarie. So yeah, that'd be a really intriguing relic for marine archaeologists, historians. Ron, I don't know if you've got any knowledge of that, or if Fort Scratchy have got any involvement in that project.
Yeah, it hasn't been drawn to my attention, Anne. We haven't had any contact to my knowledge of it.
And also other news was plans to protect the heritage with new rules around development at West Wallsend and Holmesville. More than 900 properties lie in the centre of Lake Macquarie's City Council proposal to change planning controls. And yeah, people just keeping an eye on how to protect local heritage in that area. And the council plans to expand its heritage conservation area and alter the rules surrounding development and properties within it. So yeah, as many of you know, that the history around that area is quite old, unique, a lot of industrial heritage. So anyone interested in that, that was in the news on the 21st of July. And John Shoebridge's meticulous research into pioneer pits of Tomigo is in the latest edition of Light Railways magazine. So yeah, that was published in July. So that's a really great piece of research by the late John Shoebridge. And Scott Bevan, he's been writing pieces in the Herald. I think it was the third piece on Saturday, feasting on the port and the past in Newcastle. So bringing together contemporary stories around the interviews with the current harbour master, but then reflecting on the history of the past, and interviews with the great-granddaughter of Captain Henry Newton. Now, for special collections, we've had an exhibition launch since the last meeting, and a few of you might have come along. I know Jude was there, and it was that week when the weather wasn't the best. So yeah, we unfortunately didn't probably have as many people that week. But that's open to the community, I think, until the end of September. It's the Ela Womanbilla exhibition, and Kua, if you're here. Yeah, I think he is. Kua, would you like to say a little bit more about that exhibition at all?
Okay. So the exhibition is about the right of reply and how Indigenous perspectives are not necessarily represented in a culturally safe manner within archive material. So this is a chance for Indigenous people to express what materials mean to them and have their voices alongside these sorts of materials. Yeah, I think it's up until the end of September, I think. So yeah, we've just got 2 months left of the exhibition if anyone wants to come along and check it out.
Yeah, so it's just out the front of Special Collections, near our new reading room. So it's really easy to access, and it's worth coming in and having a look. Thank you, Kua.
Yep.
Now I might hand over to Dr. Jude Conway. Jude's going to speak to us today about a gender perspective of Newcastle before the impact of the women's movement in 1970 and 1980s. So Jude has just completed her PhD this year from the University of Newcastle on the women's movement in Newcastle. So I'll hand over to Jude now, and so share the screen when you want it. Okay. Yeah. While Anne's just lining up the PowerPoint slides, I'd just like to pay my respects to the Awabakal and Worimi people still living on their unceded lands in this region. Thanks, Anne. Now, I'll start with education. The gender split in Newcastle, like everywhere in Australia, was wide before the impact of the women's movement. In 1964 in Newcastle, 20% of boys stayed on at school till 17, the leaving certificate, and only 13% of girls, which were lower rates than Sydney, for example. In 1971, female students at our university were 26% of enrolments, compared to 31.5% nationally. In the mid-1970s, our university was the 13th worst out of 15 unis in Australia with its percentage of female academics. Only the University of Tasmania and James Cook had lower percentages. How do I move along, Anne? Here we go. So now these are figures from 1981. I've marked the subjects where a more equitable breakdown might have been expected. I hope you all know the women's sign up there. So, for example, education had 22 academics and only 2 of those were women. This is 1981 I'm talking about. History had 9 academics and 2 were women who were tutors, not actually lecturers, one of whom was Margaret Henry, a friend of many of us. So overall, women made up only 8.7% of academics at Newcastle Uni in 1981. And it would have been even worse in 1970 when there was no medical faculty. In Newcastle, the local employment base was dominated by the steel industry. The few women who did work in the industry were mainly based in clean areas, such as offices, kitchens, or a few in laboratories. Men worked in those areas, as well as in the very large number of jobs in the furnaces, mills, and machine shops on the industrial plant. You've all seen, most of you have seen this slide, shows men
there may be a woman amongst there, but predominantly, certainly, maybe all men leaving at shift change at the Newcastle Steelworks. Now, other than during World War II, in times of shortages of male labour, men were brought from overseas to work in heavy industry rather than hiring local women. It was not just a decision by employers. The Federated Ironworkers Association, the FIA, largest blue-collar union in Newcastle, still believed in the 1970s that women should do work that was suitable for them, and that did not include hot and dirty work on the industrial plant. In 1973, as a result of stagflation caused by the OPEC oil crisis, the federal government directed the BHP to temporarily halt overseas recruitment. So BHP decided to employ 200 women to work in mainly finishing stages of steel production. Although the Newcastle FIA union secretary was worried that these women would give away their femininity. But anyway, this targeting of women was a temporary hiccup. In 1980, women made up less than 4% of the 11,000 strong BHP labour force, 4%. We've got a lovely sound happening here. It is a common assumption that working class women were more likely to have jobs in that era than middle class women. This was not true in Newcastle. There was a significant correlation between women in paid employment and tertiary qualifications, because the vast majority of jobs in Newcastle were low skilled and were held by men. A member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences told a gathering at the Newcastle Trades Hall in 1975 that in her homeland, 33% of engineers were women. That was light years ahead of Newcastle, which had scarce women in technical jobs, let alone engineering. A 1970s report on women and technical education in Newcastle found that socialisation from birth, gender streaming of school subjects and career advice, and the segregated workforce with its absence of female role models all dampened girls' aspirations for technical careers. It was, of course, also that individual attempts to change the status quo were rebuffed by employers. And one young woman applied for an electrical engineering traineeship. Can people hear that?
Apologies for that noise we're having, getting works done here in the library, but it's been quiet all day up to now.
When one young woman applied for an electrical engineering traineeship at the BHP in 1968, she was told to try a more ladylike profession. She also applied to the RAF at Williamtown to be a cadet aeronautical engineer. Here is part of her reply. And if you've got time to look through that, towards the end of towards the bottom, you'll see that they did consider that she would be a distraction to the other students. And there was also accommodation problems. Jobs suitable for women were in such short supply in Newcastle that out of the 10 largest cities in Australia, ours ranked next to last in proportion of women in the workforce. And in 1973, when a 25% reduction of tariffs in the clothing and textile trades caused thousands of women to be retrenched from those industries in the Hunter region, unemployment for women became even more dire. This is 1979, a queue of 1,000 women for 147 jobs in the Charlestown supermarket, which of course was the new upcoming Charlestown Square. So unemployment for Novocastrian women was more than twice as high as the unemployment rate for men in Newcastle, even for overseas born men, and was 1.5 times the national rate of female unemployment. Young women here in Newcastle experienced longer periods of unemployment than young men, even when they had better education levels. This caused a continuing outflow of young women, mainly to Sydney. Many families with non-English speaking backgrounds were reluctant to come to or remain in Newcastle because they wanted to re-establish themselves as quickly as possible, and it was so difficult for the women to obtain work. In Newcastle, the belief that once married, women should remain outside of the paid workforce. If they were working, they should resign, was shared by the ALP, trade unions, councils, public utilities, most employers, and judging by the letters to the Newcastle Morning Herald, many members of the public. I'll give you a case study of a rarity in Newcastle, a female engineer, from the rarity from those times. When a Ukrainian widow, a civil engineer, arrived in Newcastle in 1950 as a post-World War II refugee, she applied for work at the Hunter District Water Board. She was employed, but because it was thought that women couldn't do field work, presumably the bosses couldn't imagine how she could go to the toilet out in the field, she was limited to office and lab work. And then she did bad things. She remarried a year or so later. Now, at the Hunter District Water Board, women were supposed to resign, but because of her expertise in soil mechanics, she was kept on, but as a temporary employee with 6-month extensions. Over the next 4 years, she did receive a couple of promotions, which the Water Board Employees Association opposed every time, asking for her to be replaced with a male officer. The work there became so difficult, she eventually had to leave. By the 1960s, there wasn't the can work when you can't work when you're married kind of rule in Sydney. In 1966, married women were allowed permanency at the Sydney Metropolitan Water Board, but they still had to resign from the Hunter District Water Board. Figures prove the different attitude between the cities. In 1974, only 27% of married women in Newcastle had paid work, compared to 38% in Sydney. Another later case study. In 1983, Lane Amalgamated Hardware, a local manufacturer, reduced the hours of some of their women employees to a 2-day week, a practice Lanes had been carrying out for 15 years whenever law orders were low, with approval from the local Federated Ironworkers Association, which would never have approved a similar practice for their male members. Now, discrimination wasn't just in the workplace. A brief reminder of some of the other discriminations before the impact of the women's movement. Women were not allowed to be ordained as ministers in major churches. Pregnancy terminations were illegal, which made that backyard abortions the 3rd most common cause of death amongst women. Women were not allowed to be a membership or active members of surf life-saving clubs. They could only be associate members of RSLs and many sporting clubs, which meant they had no voting rights and sometimes had to use a separate entrance or participate on limited days or for limited hours. Let's look at politics. State and federal members for Newcastle and the Hunter region had always been male. Newcastle, of course, was not alone in that respect. At the start of the 1970s, there were no women amongst the 96 members of the New South Wales Legislators' Assembly, or amongst the 125 members of the Federal House of Representatives. Newcastle, however, was slow, very slow in changing the status quo here. Now, the one bright light was Joy Cummings. She was the only female member of Newcastle City Council in 1971, although 2 women had preceded her in the earlier decades. Now, as we all know, she did become the Lord Mayor in 1974, which was wonderful. But in that position, a woman in that position did not necessarily mean she could assist other women. Consider childcare. The co-option of relatives was the most common child-minding method in Newcastle before the impact of the women's movement. For example, my mother often minded my son while I was studying at uni in the late 60s. For families with no female relatives, the situation was difficult, especially as, according to one woman, in an industrial city like Newcastle, many women do not have the support of the husbands in looking after the children. Perhaps childminding did not fit a macho industrial worker image. In the early 80s, the Hunter region had the largest population in New South Wales outside of Sydney, but only ranked 3rd of all country regions in terms of children's services. What happened was that when demands for childcare were made to councils, they were pushed aside by the council staff. Despite there being a female Lord Mayor, it was difficult for women to be influential in the upper echelons of male-dominated bureaucracies, when in the past so many women were compelled to resign after marriage. The Newcastle women's movement had enormous barricades to storm to change all these old attitudes and practices. And their activities are fodder for further talks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. That was an excellent reflection of what it was like for women. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Jude? Roland? Yeah, you'll just have to unmute yourself.
I just have an observation. I noticed that in the 1980 list of academic staff at Newcastle Uni, there was no mention of a music faculty. That's probably because music was still done at the Conservatorium, which I now regard as a golden age of music in Newcastle before the university did what it did to music. But in my 4 years as a full-time student in the early 60s in music and music education, the student population was mostly women and the faculty was mostly women. That's both in music and music education. What I would say on top of that is that men quickly moved into the leadership positions when they went into employment. I was always puzzled by that at the Conservatorium, the women were often very good musicians, but when you looked at orchestras and other ensembles, the men were often in leadership positions. I'd say that if you go back 10 years or less, the Australian Chamber Orchestra was probably predominantly women in numbers, but the leadership roles were filled by men. That's an observation. One last thing is that when our class finished in 1965 at Newcastle Teachers College, and we were graduating as high school music teachers with 4 men and about 8 women, the principal came along to address us about our future. And he expressed commiserations that the women would have problems because they were much more clever than the men, but they wouldn't climb to the top of the ranks. And that was his farewell speech to our class. Indicates something about the times. Thank you.
The times then, but music was a suitable employment for women. One reason why there were quite a few women in there in early years.
Yes, it was.
I've got a question, if it's okay. I can't find the little hand thing. I'm sorry. You know, I was sort of thinking of When the Boat Comes In. It was an ABC series many years ago. And I'm wondering where these, why Newcastle is different to other places, and whether it's because of the particular sort of migration pattern into Newcastle? Is it mainly people from coal mining areas of Britain, for example, that give this long-term, isn't it incredible, resistance to women working? I mean, I'm from the Tweed. I said I was from the Tweed, and women always worked there. They always had in the fish factories and all of that kind of thing. So I'm just so surprised, and marvelous paper. And I'm just wondering why,
Why? I think because of the industry. I think because of heavy industry was like the dominance of heavy industry in Newcastle. The belief that the male was the breadwinner. Even in 1982, a trade unionist said that the male breadwinner had been around since antiquity. No, it hadn't. Women had worked always, to bring home bread for their family to eat. Aboriginal women, Asian women, you look at any area. So it was like, yes, a combination, as I said, of ALP and trade unions' belief that the male was the breadwinner. Before 1969, when women did not get equal pay, you could understand that the trade unions might have been a bit concerned about women undercutting their wages. But even after, equal pay was coming in, they were still talking about suitability of jobs. And, the industry, some of the unskilled jobs were, compared to other unskilled jobs, were better paid. And yeah, they just kept the women out, the unions, and helped keep married women. It wasn't even when you became a mother. You were supposed to resign when you were married. Newcastle was a conservative town from that. It had a high rate of unskilled jobs, as I said. So the education levels were, a bit lower. I'm talking before the impact of the women's movement, don't forget. So I think that, dominance of industry, trade unions, old-fashioned beliefs, just those things were contributed to the difference in Newcastle. Certainly there was English, a dominance of British migrants was because of the coal mining. People had been brought over from England and Wales, and Newcastle had a higher than average proportion compared to the rest of the state. Certainly compared to Sydney and compared to Wollongong, of people with, English backgrounds. But whether that helped, and that may have contributed to helping keep women out. Whereas, as I said, a lot of the migrants that came over post-World War II, they wanted their women to work. I mean, they wanted to get money quickly reset up. So if you want to look at my thesis, Paula, I talk in more length about the particular problems of Newcastle.
Thank you.
Dawn, you have a question?
Yes. An observation. Back in 1960, 61, I lived in Broken Hill. There was a local jeweller there who married one of his staff, and she continued to work. And the unions gave him an ultimatum that unless she resigned, the town would go on strike. He stood up to them. The town went on strike.
Mm.
Married women were not allowed to work.
Yeah, that's right.
He fixed it. He made her a director of the company.
Yes.
But it was,
Broken Hill was, I think, worse than Newcastle. So
I think it may have been. Yes, it was a tightly controlled
by the unions.
The Barrier Industrial Council really controlled it. But again, it was a mining community.
Mm.
Had a large proportion of people coming from the mining areas, first of all Cornwall, and they came up from South Australia from the copper mines there. And then also you had from the various coal mining areas of Great Britain. But it was very similar. And it'd be interesting to do a comparative study of the two.
I have got, I can give you one example. the Newcastle Trades Hall actually had got a woman on the committee in the early 70s, their first woman, and she was visiting Broken Hill and tried to go into the club, equivalent to the workers' club there, and to pass on a message from Newcastle Trades Hall, but she was thrown out before she could pass on the message. So we do know that's one little, example that Newcastle was a bit ahead of at Broken Hill.
Yes.
So yeah, we've got some nice comments. Thank you, Nisha, who says wonderful presentation, Jude, and Denise has put a bit of a reflection of her accounts in 1980 as an accounts payable clerk at State Dockyard. And Nancy wants to know when Jude is going to publish her thesis. Yes, which would be lovely.
Nancy, I'm looking at it chapter by chapter and trying to target it to a to the general public. I think it'll take me a while. So giving talks is part of my process of, trying to soften it up a bit and get rid of some of the theory.
Excellent approach. And I think you're right to try to direct it at general readership, because I think there's a lot in there that people generally would be very interested in. It's very eye-opening. Even though I'm familiar with this material that you've produced, to hear it put together this way is great. And everyone's coming in with their 2 cents worth. And I remember when I believe when Vicky Haskins arrived as a new appointment to our department, that I was the only other woman who was present. Now, there were a couple of people away on leave. I think Hilary Carey was away for some reason, but I felt really badly that she was coming to this place and there would be no other women's faces around her in the history discipline. And so I really reached out to her to make sure that we connected. And I'm not sure when she started with us, but, in the 2010s, I think, or just before, not as far back as you've gone. So
no.
It was a persistent issue.
Yes.
So thanks again, Jude. And I think it's been lovely having... Oh, Doug, you have a question?
Oh no, I was wondering if Jude... I was wondering if Jude remembers about Joy Cummings and how she was elected to that position, and she was expected to go at the end of the year, and that caused lots of ructions in the council.
Well, yes, there's lots of backstories could come in onto that talk. I'm sure, and of course there's a great case study too of the Lord Mayor's secretary, Zell Meehan, who
absolutely
refused to leave. She got married in her late 30s and was still expected to leave in 1956. She was secretary to McDougall, Lord Mayor McDougall, who wanted her to stay. And there was a big battle in council, and the town clerk, Charlie Jones, an ALP councillor, right-wing councillors, they thought she should resign, but there was enough progressives to support it. And when they went through the council files, they found that it was only tradition that women should resign. There was no actual bylaw that married women should resign. Anyway, Zell held the ground and stayed on to be Lord Mayor's secretary to 4 Lord Mayors, including Joy Cummings.
Yes, she was good.
And I think we've got all histories with Zell Meehan and with Charlie Smith and Charlie, who did you mention from the...
Charlie Jones.
Yeah, we've got interviews with him. So thank you, Jude, and thank you, Paula. I just think it's been a lovely sort of dual sort of themed with women and history, and so it's been fantastic. Now, can I introduce you to our colleague at the University of Newcastle here, Dr. Nisha Thaplia. So we've had a bit of contact with Nisha this year, the Special Collections team, that Nisha is interested in Indian Australian related to South Asia. She's in the process of putting together like the design stage of a project, but was really keen to sort of engage with this showcase and community just to start that conversation going. So Nisha, welcome to the meeting, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here, and such a fascinating conversation in the first two presentations. I really enjoyed listening. So hello, everyone. I'm Nisha Thaplyal. I'm an academic in the School of Education, and I'm joining you today with my research assistant, Dr. Felix Pal. I'm not sure if his camera is on or not, but Felix and I have been fumbling our way through new territory for the last 6 months, and I'm very pleased to be. You're luckily or unluckily, you're the first audience to hear what we've been trying to learn about and think through. But I'd like, can you see my slideshow?
We can see it, yeah. I don't know, yeah, if you want to sort of make it a little bit bigger, yep, if you want to press that.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we live, work, and meet today, the Awabakal Nation. I would like very much to thank Anne, Paige, John DeGravio, I don't think he's here today, all of whom have answered. As I said, my background is in education, and they've very patiently answered all my questions, silly or not, which is why I'm here with you today. And I'd also like to thank Nancy, who's here, I think, and Vicky Haskins, who've also been incredibly generous colleagues just again, helping me think through some of this. And I must apologize. I had COVID last week, and I'm not quite sure I'm all well. It feels like my brain is full of holes, so please bear with me if I don't make sense. But what I'm going to do, as Anne said, is just share a little bit about what we know so far about South Asian, Australian migrant activist histories, and then ask if anyone here has anything to share specifically to our region, which is Newcastle and the Hunter. There isn't a project as yet. We've been mapping what's out there for the last 6 months and studying similar work in the context of other South Asian diasporas. The ones I know the best are the English-speaking ones for obvious reasons in North America and the UK. And that's some of the images you see from the South Asian American Digital Archive. And today, my request is for any local information about South Asians in Newcastle. My particular background is in, I study social movements and sites of activism in the domain of public education and human rights. So initially this project started with an interest in radical South Asian Australian histories. Jude's wonderful work around radical Newcastle, and perhaps I'll get really lucky and find something about the South Asian migrants who were part of those radical struggles, but so far no luck. But anything that this incredibly informed community knows, we'd be grateful to learn from you, and of course any funding sources. Excuse me. I won't do the detailed history. I'm sure all of you know this very well, but people from my part of the world, so I am from India. I grew up in Calcutta on the eastern coast of India. So people from my part of the world have been in Australia pre-settlement. They came as sailors, traders, etc. And then with British settlement, they came as convicts, hawkers, cameleers, and so on. You know this history better than me, I suspect. And as farmers. And then there was, of course, a long pause because of white Australia. And then the migration resumed post-white Australia. I'm interested in South Asians, just to be very clear, because the Indian sort of parameter really doesn't make sense given the history, the transnational histories of the two regions of the world. So I'm working with sort of parameters like South Asia, also language. So the two communities that have been here the longest are the Punjabi and the Bengali speaking communities, possibly Tamil as well, but I haven't looked into it. And then, of course, religion is another lens into figuring out where the South Asians were. Again, all of these are very imperfect windows, but I'm just sort of sharing the methodology I've been making up as, you know, as someone who's doing this for the first time. So what do we know? As I said, we do know a great deal about, around the time of settlement, as I said, the Cameliers, the Hawkers, the Lascars, and the Seamen. So that's a sort of clear chunk of work that's been, I think historians have been doing a lot of. We know a little bit about the Indian Anzacs. And this is in no particular order, I'm sorry. We know quite a bit about Anglo-Indians. And again, I'm not sure if people are familiar with this terminology, but I'm referring to the descendants of European and South Asian, relationships. There are different names for them. In India, we refer to them as Anglo-Indians. In Burma, they had a different name. In Ceylon, they were referred to as the Burghers, and so on and so forth. So there's a sizable community here and has been since settlement time. So they have done quite a bit in documenting their own history. And then there's the very contemporary work, the living histories of South Asian Australian migrants. And where is this information? Well, there's a bit of community history work. The Sikh community, perhaps because they've been here the longest, we came across several heritage projects. As many of you know, there's a Sikh community up on the North Coast. They have a museum. And then in Western Australia, of course. In Victoria, there's the Australian Indian Historical Society, also funded by Sikh Australian associations initially. They were formed out of concerns of racism, and they've brought out a 4 or 5 series book, again, on these sort of various phases of migration. We have some immigration museums. We have some South Asian studies collections at universities, that center mostly on colonial records. The national and state libraries, of course, have passenger lists and so forth. We've also, coming to living histories, South Asian Australian writers and artists, along with Indigenous Australians, writers and artists with South Asian heritage, have also been a source of information for us. They are sort of doing some of this historical work, but also documenting the living histories. And in terms of geographical links so far, that the strongest appear to be to Western Australia and Tasmania. Excuse me. So now we come to the Hunter and the New South Wales, and everything I present to you is because of the help from John. Maybe 1 or 2 bullet points at the end is a little bit of work that I've done since John and I met. John told me that the first coal shipment report that left Newcastle went to Bengal. This is pre-official settlement. And you have a lovely little article on the Hunter Living Histories site, and with a couple of images. The Bishop of Calcutta was responsible for the colony of New South Wales, and the Anglican Church of Australia initially came under the Diocese of Calcutta. That's a typo. In the 1850s, there were shipments of Anglo-Indians from Madras, now known as Chennai, to Sydney by a judge called Sir William Burton, who wanted those Christian folk to be with, their own kind. And as I've already said, there's, different kinds of documentation of the Lascars and the Cameliers and so forth. John also told me that they were often referred to as pagans in census records. So part of this, the methodological learning journey for me has just been developing my vocabulary on how to go looking for this information, right? Along with terms like hawkers and dirty Hindus and so on, and Afghans, which is a complete misnomer. So that's part of it. And then we don't know anything post-White Australia really about South Asians in the Hunter, but of course we know they are here. Not in the least because of the Colombo Plan, which brought the first international students. John told me something about Matron Porter, but he didn't finish that story. I meant to ask him today, but he's not with us, so I'll have to follow it up. I'm sorry, I can't finish that story for you. And then we also, the last 2 years have been very hard with the pandemic and lockdown, and the hour I spent with John a month ago was one of the best hours in those last 2 years. So by the end, we were brainstorming on where we might go to begin to piece together some of these stories. So he had the brilliant idea also of looking at Newcastle business records, some of the older businesses like BHP and Arnott. He also shared that in 2010, the Indian Consul General Amit Dasgupta came to look at an exhibition at the university, but he also took the time to thank local community groups who had come out in support of Indian and South Asian international students. This was following the racist attacks. So that's what John told me. And then I had a quick look at places of worship, but not much. The Hindu temple in Cardiff is about 25 years old. There is no Sikh Gurudwara. There's an association that's trying to build one in Rutherford. And then there is, of course, an Islamic association, but they are not necessarily, their membership is not just South Asian, right? It's pan-Islamic. Yes, and this is a picture that John put me onto about Indian Charlie and his pipe. This was taken on the North Coast. Sorry, I don't have the date for you. But I think this is also part of the Hunter Living Histories collection. So that's it really. Lots of gaps. As I said, we know more about the early migration, apparently, than the later arrivals. It's particularly hard to hear the stories of women, as Vicky Haskins has already, said with her Ayas and Amas project that I think all of you are familiar with. This is an image from that fantastic project. They're about to launch their digital exhibition in case anyone's interested. I've been waiting for it for quite a while now. And yes, so it's just difficult to find sources on post-White Australia migrations, including international students, but of course, they are not the only group of migrants. So that's it. That's about all I know. Thank you for all suggestions and feedback. Thank you. I'll stop talking and listen now.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And we'll also share your contact details on the Hunter Living Histories blog post, so people can contact you directly as well. And we'll also pass that on to Johnny de Gravia. He was here most of the morning, but then had to leave urgently. So yeah, he'll be disappointed that he missed this, your sort of presentation. But I just think you've set the design up really well. Is there anyone in the group? I'll just get you to maybe stop sharing now, Nisha. And is there anyone from the group that might have any ideas they can sort of put to Nisha now? Or yeah, Paula?
I don't know if you've you know this or you've done any work on it. Serena Scott, when she was running Glendon in the early 1850s, she had what she called coolies who were from Calcutta. But what is interesting about them is that they went to court because they said the food that they were being sold on the estate or the run was too expensive compared to Calcutta. So it's like a kind of strike action that they took. And I can send you that letter if you want.
Please, thank you. That would be so helpful. I've heard of other sort of strikes by workers about the conditions, the servants who came during that time, but not this particular one. Thank you.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any other feedback or suggestions for Nisha? John? John, you're just on mute.
I just looked up my essay I wrote about policing gays in the Hunter. Helena Scott was born in Bombay. Helena Scott was, I think, one of the pioneers of the Upper Hunter. And yeah, that's right, he was. He was the judge at of a case with Frank Redmond, who was a cook in town. I think there's a whole backstory about Helenas.
Thank you. Could you put that name in the chat, please?
Yeah, sure.
Not familiar to me. Thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of these colonial families spent time on the way out, didn't they? So it'd be interesting to know what connections they kept. Or
Helena Scott's father, he worked in Bombay for a while. They actually lived in India for a while, but they were very white.
Yeah.
They, what's interesting is that they were still there and travelling back and forth from the Hunter to India and writing letters from India, because Patrick was in the military in India. Patrick Scott was in the military, you see. So there's a lot of communication between the families connected to theirs, Singapore and somewhere else. So yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And also Mark Fenwick has made the comment that some of the first doctors here were from South Asia.
Yes.
It may even be worth contacting, just to find out from some of the trained doctors here at Newcastle. Some of and I know around Newlambton, Adamstown in the 70s, there were a lot of GPs from Indian descent. So.
I was speaking to my GP and he said there were Indian Doctors Associations that were very active, and now because of the politics at home, that those associations, that community has fragmented again along lines of religious and linguistic identity. But when he came 40 years ago, for example, they all got together to talk about everything under the sun, to support the transition and so on. Mark has put something else in the chat.
Yeah, so Edward Charles Close from Morpeth, and he was an engineer, did a lot of those early artworks of Newcastle.
I see.
He was born in Bengal. We were mentioning the Matron Porter. So we're doing an oral history with a nurse from the Royal who knew Matron Porter. She's coming in again next week. So if there's any sort of, anyhow, there might, if she mentions anything, I can sort of at least, have a listen. And some of the Colombo students were awarded keys to the city last week. I don't know if you saw that in the media. So it might even be worth just having a look at who those recipients were. But there was about 8 of them were awarded keys to the city. So look, Nisha, thank you so much, and just encourage anyone to sort of send anything else after the meeting directly to Nisha or to myself, and I can hand it over.
Thanks so much, Anne.
No problems, Nisha. Next month, our meeting will be on Monday, the 5th of September. That's right at the beginning of History Week. So I'm just going to share in the chat now. The History Week theme is hands-on history this year. And we may be sort of organising a Hunter Living Histories meeting to be an event and have some speakers that can talk about crossover between history and archives, cultural heritage that's very hands-on. So if anyone has any ideas of presenters or have a project that sort of fits that theme, yeah, certainly let us know. Now we've run 2 minutes over time. Is there anything anyone wants to sort of bring up the very last minute? Nothing else? So look, thank you everyone, and yeah, have a great month, and we'll see you all on the 5th of September. And thanks again to all our speakers. It's really greatly appreciated. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.